My name is Claire Bennett, and 6 days ago, my father called me crying from a hospital bed, asking why nobody from his real family had come to see him yet. 3 hours later, I signed paperwork placing him into the cheapest state-funded nursing facility within 50 miles of the city, while his wife and stepchildren fought over who should avoid taking responsibility for him next. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why some parents spend decades investing emotionally in the wrong people and only realize it after age, illness, and money remove the illusion of loyalty. And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, family hypocrisy, and the moment neglected daughters stop sacrificing themselves for people who abandoned them first, subscribe and let me know what you would have done in my place. When I was 9 years old, my father sat me down in our kitchen and explained that adults sometimes fall out of love and need to make difficult choices for their own happiness. At the time, I believed him because children naturally trust the parent who sounds calmest while destroying their world. 2 weeks later, he moved into a large suburban house across town with the woman my mother already suspected he was seeing for almost a year. Her name was Linda, and she came with 2 children already calling my father Dad before the divorce papers were even finalized. That was the beginning of my education in replacement. At first, my father pretended he wanted balance. Shared weekends, equal holidays, phone calls every night. But blended families reveal priorities quickly once inconvenience enters the picture. Linda hated when I stayed over because, according to her, I made the house feel tense. Her son, Tyler, needed stability. Her daughter, Emma, struggled with emotional transitions. Their routines mattered more. Their comfort mattered more. Slowly, my visits became shorter, then less frequent, then conditional. If Tyler had baseball tournaments, my weekends got canceled. If Emma felt overwhelmed, holiday plans changed. My father always apologized, softly afterward, like regret, somehow erased patterns. Meanwhile, my mother worked herself into exhaustion trying to hold our life together after the divorce. She picked up double shifts at the hospital, sold jewelry her grandmother left her, and quietly learned how to survive without expecting help from anyone. Looking back now, I realize she understood the truth years before I did. My father was not balancing 2 families. He was building a new one while slowly reducing contact with the old one, until abandonment looked natural instead of intentional. The worst part was not the financial struggle. It was watching him become a better father for someone else's children. Tyler got private baseball coaching. Emma got expensive summer camps. My father attended school plays, soccer games, birthdays, and family vacations with them while constantly missing my milestones because work became complicated whenever I needed something. At 12 years old, I sat alone at an academic awards ceremony, scanning the audience for him while another girl's father recorded the event from the front row. He called 2 hours later apologizing because Tyler's tournament ran late. The next week, Linda posted photos online from the tournament dinner celebrating family first. And that phrase stayed with me for years. Family first. Just never mine. As I got older, I stopped asking for things because rejection becomes easier to manage when you predict it early enough. My father still called occasionally, still sent birthday money sometimes, still performed just enough guilt to convince himself he had not fully failed me. But effort without consistency eventually starts feeling insulting. By high school, I saw him maybe once every 2 months unless appearances required more. Then came college. I earned partial scholarships and got accepted into a strong nursing program 3 hours away. And for the first time in years, I genuinely hoped my father might show up for me emotionally. Instead, he told me during lunch one afternoon that financial support would be difficult because Tyler was preparing for college athletics and Emma's private school tuition had increased again. He said he wished things were different, but blended families create complicated obligations. Blended families. Another phrase that really meant I already lost. My mother took out additional loans to help me finish school, while my father helped Tyler buy a used Mustang for his 18th birthday. I remember seeing photos of the car online while eating vending machine crackers during a 12-hour clinical shift because I could not afford proper groceries that week. That was the moment something inside me changed permanently. Not dramatically, quietly, I stopped thinking of my father as someone I could rely on emotionally and started viewing him more like a distant relative who occasionally appeared carrying guilt instead of love. Years passed. I became a registered nurse, eventually moved back to the city, and built a stable life slowly through exhaustion and discipline. Meanwhile, my father's new family looked perfect from the outside. Tyler became a financial advisor. Emma married into money. Linda filled social media with family vacation photos and captions about gratitude, blessings, and unconditional love. My father aged into the exact suburban retirement life he chose over us decades earlier. Then my mother died. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal. I spent 9 months watching the strongest person I knew disappear piece by piece, while my father visited exactly 4 times total. Linda came once carrying flowers and awkward sympathy, before leaving after 20 minutes because hospitals made her uncomfortable. Tyler and Emma never visited at all. At the funeral, my father cried harder than anyone. People kept telling me how devastated he looked, but all I could think while standing beside my mother's casket was that grief feels very different when you abandon the hardest years and arrive only for the ending. After the funeral, my father tried reconnecting more consistently. Weekly calls, occasional lunches, awkward attempts at emotional honesty. I think my mother's death forced him to confront something uncomfortable for the first time. He was getting older, and the one person who always quietly carried the emotional weight of my existence was gone now. Maintaining relationships requires effort once guilt loses its middleman. Still, even then, I remained secondary. Linda retired early and developed expensive lifestyle habits. Tyler went through a messy divorce and moved back into my father's house temporarily with massive debt. Emma and her husband constantly needed financial help maintaining appearances far above their actual income level. My father spent his retirement savings solving problems for the family he chose, while assuring me repeatedly that everything was under control. Then 6 months ago, Linda left him. Not for another man. For freedom. That was the humiliating part. Apparently, after 30 years together, she decided she no longer wanted the responsibility of aging beside someone developing health problems and financial stress. Tyler refused to take him in because his condo lacked space. Emma claimed her husband would never agree to long-term care arrangements inside their house. Suddenly, the man who spent decades prioritizing everyone else discovered loyalty becomes fragile once money, convenience, and image disappear. Then came the hospital call 6 days ago. Congestive heart failure, early kidney complications, minor stroke symptoms. I arrived at the hospital around midnight after finishing a brutal shift, and the first thing my father said when he saw me was something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. He asked why nobody else came. For several seconds after my father asked why nobody else came, I just stood there beside the hospital bed staring at him because the question itself revealed how disconnected he still was from reality. Even after everything collapsed around him, part of him genuinely believed the family he spent 30 years prioritizing would eventually show up once things became serious enough. That belief almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. The room smelled faintly like antiseptic and stale coffee, the familiar hospital combination I spent most of my adult life surrounded by. But seeing my father lying there in a thin gown with trembling hands felt deeply different from caring for ordinary patients. Nurses know how fragile people become once illness strips away status and routine. I had watched wealthy executives cry over basic mobility problems and arrogant men beg strangers for help using bathrooms. But this was the first time I watched a parent confront the consequences of emotional investments made decades earlier. I asked whether Linda knew he was hospitalized. He nodded weakly and said she sent a text asking for updates because hospitals stress her out emotionally. Hearing that nearly made me laugh, because the woman who spent years posting inspirational quotes about unconditional family love could not tolerate fluorescent lights and medical inconvenience long enough to visit the man who financed most of her adult life. Then I asked about Tyler and Emma. Tyler apparently promised to come after work, but never arrived. Emma claimed her youngest daughter had dance rehearsals, and suggested maybe visiting during the weekend if things stabilized. My father kept explaining their excuses softly, almost defensively, like he still needed to protect them from criticism, even while lying alone in a cardiac unit at midnight. That dynamic told me everything immediately. He still did not understand. Even now, abandoned and frightened, he continued emotionally shielding the people who abandoned him first. Over the next 2 days, his condition stabilized enough for discharge planning discussions to begin. That was when reality finally became unavoidable, because hospitals discharge patients quickly once immediate danger passes, and my father no longer qualified for independent living safely. Mild stroke complications affected balance and memory enough that doctors recommended assisted care temporarily, maybe permanently depending on recovery progress. The second social workers started discussing placement options, the disappearing act began. Linda stopped answering calls consistently. Tyler suddenly became overwhelmed with work deadlines. Emma kept saying she needed to discuss logistics with her husband first. Meanwhile, every conversation somehow redirected back toward me because, unlike the rest of them, I actually understood what his condition meant practically. I knew how difficult recovery could become. I knew how quickly temporary assistance turns into long-term dependency, once age and health problems combine. Most importantly, everyone assumed nursing instincts automatically translate into personal obligation. By the third day, I realized something disturbing. Nobody in his chosen family intended to take responsibility for him. Not emotionally, not financially, not physically. They all expected someone else to absorb the burden while preserving the image of being caring people publicly. And somehow, despite everything, that someone else was slowly becoming me. The breaking point came during a family meeting inside one of the hospital consultation rooms. Linda arrived wearing expensive jewelry and oversized sunglasses, despite the cloudy weather outside. And within 10 minutes, it became obvious she approached the situation like an inconvenience threatening her retirement lifestyle. Tyler spent most of the meeting staring at his phone while talking vaguely about work pressure. Emma kept discussing how emotionally difficult the situation felt for everyone, while offering absolutely no practical solutions. Then the social worker asked the direct question: who will be responsible for post-discharge care arrangements? Silence. Actual silence. Everybody suddenly looked thoughtful, concerned, overwhelmed, but nobody volunteered. Finally, Linda looked at me and said Claire understands medical environments best, which instantly irritated me because manipulative families always disguise exploitation as praise. Tyler immediately agreed, saying I would know which facilities are safest because of my nursing experience. Emma nodded sympathetically and added that Dad always trusted my judgment. That sentence almost made me laugh. My judgment mattered now. Not when I needed tuition help. Not when my mother worked double shifts. Not when I sat alone at school ceremonies, scanning crowds for him. Now, when aging, illness, and inconvenience entered the room. I looked directly at all of them and asked a very simple question. If I refuse, what exactly is your plan? Nobody answered immediately because for the first time, they realized the neglected daughter they ignored for decades was now the only thing standing between my father and complete abandonment. Then, Linda said something that permanently changed the emotional direction of the situation. She admitted quietly that she could not financially handle long-term care because most of their retirement savings were already gone. Gone. That word landed heavily. Over the next hour, the truth surfaced piece by piece. My father spent years draining retirement accounts, helping Tyler recover from business debt, funding Emma's lifestyle emergencies, and maintaining the expensive suburban image Linda insisted on preserving after retirement. Between medical costs, financial loans never repaid, and years of overspending, there was almost nothing left besides the house itself, which still carried debt. Suddenly, everything made horrifying sense. The people my father sacrificed everything for emotionally had already taken nearly everything from him financially too. And now that his usefulness disappeared, so did they. After the meeting ended, my father asked me privately whether I thought the others seemed stressed because of his condition. That question genuinely stunned me, because even then, he still interpreted neglect as temporary pressure instead of rejection. I looked at him sitting there weak and frightened in the hospital bed and realized something painful. My father spent 30 years mistaking dependency for love. As long as he provided money, stability, and problem solving, everyone around him treated him like the center of the family. The moment he became expensive instead of useful, the emotional math changed. Then he asked the question I knew was coming eventually. He asked whether he could stay with me temporarily during recovery. For a second, every version of my childhood flashed through my mind at once. Sitting alone at ceremonies waiting for him. Watching Tyler receive everything I quietly learned not to ask for. My mother crying privately over bills, while my father funded vacations for another family across town. Years of being emotionally optional, until responsibility became inconvenient for everyone else. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. This was the first time in my entire life my father genuinely needed me more than I needed him. That realization felt heavier than anger. It felt dangerous. I told him I needed time to think. Then I left the room before he could see the expression on my face, because part of me already knew the decision I was going to make, and I was not ready to admit it out loud yet. I spent the next 2 days avoiding my father's calls while pretending I still needed time to think, but the truth was much uglier than indecision. I already knew I was not bringing him into my home. The guilt came from understanding exactly why. People love talking about forgiveness abstractly because abstract forgiveness costs nothing. Real forgiveness becomes much more complicated when it demands your time, peace, money, emotional energy, and future. Taking my father in would not mean offering temporary support for a sick man. It would mean restructuring my entire life around caring for the same parent who spent decades restructuring his life around everyone, except me. Still, the guilt followed me everywhere. At work, I found myself watching elderly patients whose families rotated bedside visits faithfully, and I kept wondering whether I was becoming cruel. Then, I would remember my mother driving home, exhausted after 16-hour shifts, while my father paid for Disney vacations with Linda's children. I would remember sitting alone at graduation dinners, because Tyler's baseball schedule conflicted with my plans. I would remember my father saying blended families are complicated every time I needed something, while somehow nothing ever became complicated when his new family needed him. Those memories hardened something inside me again. By Friday morning, the hospital demanded a finalized discharge plan because insurance would no longer cover extended inpatient recovery. That was when the performance from the rest of the family collapsed completely. Linda stopped answering calls entirely. Emma texted saying she was emotionally overwhelmed and trusted me to make the best decision. Tyler called once only to ask whether selling the house quickly might protect any remaining assets before long-term care costs increased. Not once during that conversation did he ask how his father was feeling physically. Just finances. That detail mattered because it exposed the truth underneath decades of family performance. My father believed he built a loving household, but what he really built was dependence disguised as closeness. The moment he stopped functioning as a provider, everyone emotionally detached almost immediately. That afternoon, I met with the hospital social worker alone. Her name was Denise, and after 20 years coordinating elder care placement, she had the exhausted expression of someone who already understood most family dynamics before people explained them. She reviewed the financial situation carefully, then told me something bluntly. Because my father's assets were nearly depleted, his realistic options narrowed significantly. Private assisted living facilities required money he no longer had. Home healthcare support would become unstable quickly without a dedicated caregiver. Medicaid-supported nursing facilities were possible, but quality varied dramatically depending on funding and availability. Then she asked the question everyone else kept avoiding. Are you personally willing to become his primary caregiver? The room went quiet. I stared down at the paperwork for several seconds before answering honestly. No. Saying it out loud felt strangely physical, like stepping through something emotionally solid after years of hesitation. Denise did not judge me. If anything, she looked unsurprised. Hospital workers learn quickly that daughters become emotional safety nets for families far more often than sons do, especially daughters raised to confuse guilt with obligation. Then she asked another question. Do you feel guilty because he needs help, or because people expect you to help? That question stayed in my head the entire drive home, because the answer was obvious once someone finally separated the two things. My guilt had almost nothing to do with my father's condition itself. It came from decades of social conditioning teaching women that self-sacrifice equals moral worth, especially inside families. That night, my father called again. This time I answered. He sounded smaller somehow, emotionally exhausted in a way I never heard before. He asked whether I made any decisions yet, and for several seconds I could not speak because despite everything, he was still my father. Children never fully stop wanting their parents to become the people they needed years ago. Then he said something that nearly changed my mind. He apologized. Not vaguely, not defensively, actually apologized. He admitted he spent years convincing himself he could balance both families while quietly allowing me to become emotionally optional, because confronting the truth would have forced him to see himself clearly. He admitted watching Linda's children need him felt easier because they adored him automatically, while every interaction with me carried guilt he never wanted to face. Then he said the sentence that hurt most. He told me my mother carried responsibilities he should have shared while he played hero somewhere else. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked whether this was punishment. That question changed everything emotionally, because suddenly, I realized my father still misunderstood the situation fundamentally. He thought my hesitation came from revenge. It didn't. Revenge would have required hatred. What I actually felt was exhaustion. 30 years of emotional exhaustion. I told him quietly, this is what happens when someone spends decades teaching people they can survive without you. Eventually, they believe it too. He started crying after that. Not dramatic crying. Old man crying. The kind that sounds less like emotion and more like collapse. And honestly, that almost broke me. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment kitchen for almost an hour staring at nothing because I understood the real tragedy finally. My father did love me in his own limited way. The problem was that weak love still creates real damage when combined with cowardice. He kept choosing the easier emotional path repeatedly until those choices became a life. The next morning, I toured 3 nursing facilities with Denise. The first looked clean online but smelled faintly like bleach and neglect the moment we entered. The second had long wait lists and costs my father could never afford. The third was state-funded, understaffed, and emotionally depressing, but at least the nurses seemed competent and the residents looked genuinely cared for despite limited resources. While walking through the hallways, I kept imagining what my family would say once they learned where I placed him. Heartless daughter. Cruel. Ungrateful. The irony almost made me laugh, because nobody volunteering criticism wanted responsibility themselves. Then Denise said something quietly while reviewing paperwork beside me. She told me children are not rehabilitation centers for parents who spent decades making harmful choices. That sentence settled something inside me permanently. By the time I returned to the hospital that evening, my decision was already made. My father looked relieved when I entered the room, because I think part of him still believed guilt would eventually push me into bringing him home. He asked whether I figured something out, and I told him yes. Then I explained the nursing facility arrangement carefully. At first he looked confused, then embarrassed, then devastated. Not because the facility was terrible, because for the first time in his life, he fully understood his position inside the emotional hierarchy he created. Linda was not coming. Tyler was not rearranging his life. Emma was not offering her home. And the daughter he treated like a backup plan for 30 years was not sacrificing her future to rescue him from the consequences of those choices either. He asked quietly whether I really could not make room for him somewhere in my apartment. That question hurt more than anger would have, because suddenly he sounded less like the father from my childhood and more like an abandoned old man realizing too late that loyalty cannot survive forever on guilt alone. I told him the truth. I spent most of my life making emotional room for you, while you made room for everyone else first. I can help manage your care, visit you, and make sure you're safe. But I cannot build my entire life around repairing choices you spent decades making willingly. He looked away after that. And for the first time since the hospital called, he stopped arguing. The day I transferred my father into the nursing facility felt strangely similar to attending a funeral, because both experiences force you to confront final versions of people you spent years misunderstanding. The facility itself was not abusive or horrifying the way dramatic stories make nursing homes seem. It was simply sad in the quiet, ordinary way institutional loneliness usually is. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, elderly residents staring at televisions they barely watched. Nurses moving quickly because there were too many patients and not enough staff. The kind of place people end up when families run out of money, energy, or willingness. My father barely spoke during the drive there. He spent most of the ride staring silently through the passenger window, while I handled paperwork calls through Bluetooth with the facility administrator. Occasionally, he asked small practical questions about meal schedules or physical therapy, but underneath all of it sat something much heavier: humiliation. Not because the nursing home itself was beneath him, but because the fantasy he built around his chosen family finally collapsed completely. At one point during the drive, he asked quietly whether Linda knew where he was going. I told him yes. Then he asked whether she said anything. I hesitated before answering because the truth sounded cruel, even to me. Linda's only response after hearing the placement details was asking whether the house paperwork could be finalized quickly before long-term care costs complicated ownership issues. That answer visibly broke something inside him. For the first time since this started, he stopped defending her. When we arrived, a nurse helped settle him into a small shared room beside an elderly man, sleeping through most of the intake process. My father looked around, slowly taking in the narrow bed, faded curtains, and plastic dresser that would now hold the remainder of his daily life. Watching him sit there felt emotionally confusing, because part of me still saw the man who abandoned my mother emotionally decades earlier. But another part saw a frightened old man confronting the reality that people rarely sacrifice for someone who spent years teaching them convenience comes first. Before I left, he asked if I would visit often. That question hurt, because despite everything, he still sounded hopeful in the same fragile way children sound after disappointing birthdays. I told him I would visit when I could and make sure his care stayed monitored properly. He nodded slowly, but both of us understood what I was really saying. I would not abandon him completely, but I was no longer willing to destroy myself, proving I was more loyal than everyone else. The reactions from the family started almost immediately. Emma called first, not to ask how her father was adjusting, to ask whether the facility looked depressing. That wording irritated me instantly, because people obsessed with appearances always frame suffering aesthetically first. I told her it looked exactly like the type of place families choose when nobody wants responsibility personally. She went quiet after that. Then Tyler called angry. According to him, placing Dad in a state-supported nursing facility looked terrible socially considering how successful the family appeared publicly. That sentence genuinely stunned me because even now, even after abandoning the man emotionally for months, his biggest concern remained optics. He started suggesting maybe we could rotate care temporarily or pool money together for something more private. I asked one simple question. How much money are you personally contributing? Silence. Then excuses. Business pressure. Divorce debt. Market instability. The usual. That conversation finally killed the remaining guilt inside me, because suddenly, I saw the entire dynamic clearly. Everyone expected moral authority without sacrifice. They wanted the emotional image of being loving children, without any inconvenience attached to it. Meanwhile, I was the only one carrying actual responsibility, despite being the person my father neglected first. 2 weeks passed. Then something unexpected happened. My father started changing. Not dramatically, quietly. During my visits, he stopped talking about Linda constantly. stopped making excuses for Tyler and Emma, stopped pretending temporary circumstances explained everything. Illness and loneliness stripped away the emotional denial he spent decades protecting himself with. One afternoon, while I helped organize medications beside his bed, he admitted something I never thought I would hear from him. He said he spent most of his life confusing being needed with being loved. That sentence explained almost everything. Linda needed financial stability. Tyler needed rescue money. Emma needed lifestyle support. As long as he solved problems, paid bills, and protected appearances, he felt important. But real love becomes visible when usefulness disappears. And by then, it was too late for him to build the kind of relationships that survive dependency instead of benefiting from it. Then one afternoon, he asked me a question that stayed in my head for days afterward. He asked whether my mother hated him at the end. I told him the truth. No, that was the tragedy. My mother exhausted herself trying to survive life after him, but I do not think she ever truly hated him. I think eventually she just understood him clearly. There is a difference. He cried quietly after that. Not loud, not dramatic. Just silent tears from a man finally realizing clarity can hurt more than anger. Around the same time, Linda's situation started collapsing too. Without my father's financial support, maintaining the expensive suburban lifestyle became difficult quickly. Tyler moved out again after another argument about money. Emma stopped visiting Linda regularly once childcare support disappeared. The entire perfect family image my father sacrificed everything to preserve started fracturing almost immediately once resources dried up. The irony was brutal. My father spent 30 years abandoning one family to maintain another, only to discover the second family existed largely because he financed it emotionally and financially. Then came the final conversation that changed everything between us. It happened late one evening, about 3 months after he entered the facility. I arrived after work and found him sitting alone near a window overlooking the parking lot. He looked older than I remembered, thinner somehow, like regret itself physically reduced him over time. He asked me something quietly. He asked whether I ever wished he simply disappeared completely after the divorce, instead of staying partially involved all those years. At first, I did not answer because the question itself was devastating. Then I realized he was finally asking the correct thing. Not whether I forgave him. Not whether he was a terrible father, but whether partial love sometimes damages children more than absence. So I answered honestly. I told him full abandonment probably would have hurt less eventually because children can heal around clear loss. What destroys people slowly is inconsistent love. Being important only when convenient. Spending years hoping this time the parent will finally choose you equally. That kind of disappointment reshapes how you value yourself. He covered his face after that and cried harder than I had ever seen before. Then he apologized again. But this time felt different. Not guilt. Not self-pity. Recognition. Real recognition. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he said something quietly that became the real ending to the story. He told me I spent my whole life treating you like you'd always wait for me to become better later. That sentence settled over the room heavily because it was true. Every missed birthday, canceled weekend, ignored milestone, and emotional compromise rested on the assumption that someday he would finally balance things correctly. Someday he would prioritize me properly. Someday he would make the waiting worth it. But someday is how selfish people delay accountability until life removes the option entirely. My father chose his new family decades ago. And in the end, I chose his nursing home not because I hated him, but because I finally understood that loving someone does not obligate you to sacrifice your entire future, cleaning up the emotional consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most honest thing a neglected daughter can do is stop volunteering to be the backup plan for people who never made her their first one. If you were in my place, would you have taken him into your home, or would you have made the same decision? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, difficult choices, and the moment parents finally face the consequences of the children they neglected, like and subscribe because the next story might hit even harder.